Good morning and welcome everybody. This is the Volunteers Mobilization Center orientation for disaster preparedness. My name is Pat Lynham and I am a volunteer. I'm part of a team of volunteers associated with the Volunteer Mobilization Center. The Volunteer Mobilization Center actually is a processing center for those folks who want to volunteer and help during a catastrophic event or disaster. The objective today is to encourage you to be a part of this great team who would mobilize during any type of a catastrophic event, whether it be man-made or an act of nature. I'm going to turn this over right now to Mel Monkelis, who is the program director for the RSVP program for the Volunteer Center of Whatcom County. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say a few minutes. First, thank you for coming. We've had an overwhelming response. We started out at Garden Street that held 200. When we realized that, we moved here. And so thank you for your interest, for your response, and we want to recruit all of you as volunteers, whether it be with the Volunteer Mobilization Center, or whether it be with the CERT program, or the Search and Rescue, or any of the programs in Whatcom County. I want to take a minute. If all the members of the VMC committee, that's Volunteer Mobilization Center, can they stand up and let's give them an applause for putting this together? Now, all the volunteers that are working here today, can those people stand up also? Please. Nothing gets done without volunteers. I think we all know that. And as Pat was saying, what is the VMC? The VMC is called into action by the Whatcom County Sheriff if there's an overwhelming emergency. We're talking about earthquakes or anything like that. They call us in, they say, we need you set up. They have the location, and it's simply a processing center for volunteers who show up. OSO showed us that hundreds of people respond when the need is out there. And so when the need is out there, the Volunteer Mobilization Center is set up to process you, get you in the building, processed, and out to the disaster site where you're working to help people. So that's what the Volunteer Mobilization is all about. We're going to meet regularly throughout the year. We're going to hear different speakers. We're going to develop friendships. So if you want to join, be part of the team, please do so, but also join CERT, join the American Red Cross, join Search and Rescue, or join Map My Neighborhood. Any of those groups can help you. Lastly, you guys are in for a special treat. We have an outstanding array of speakers here, from Rebeka delivering the keynote and all the others on the town hall panel. So I'd like to just stop and let's give them an applause right now for taking their Saturday. Thank you for coming. And Rebeka, I think we're ready for your keynote. Thank you.
Okay, so we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Rebeka Paci-Green, who is the director of the Resilience Institute at Western Washington University. She has extensive experience in community recovery plans and disaster risk reduction. She'll be speaking about the types of damages Whatcom County residents can expect here from a Cascade Subduction Zone earthquake and tsunami, the big one, and the policy mitigation and preparedness actions that we can take to reduce damage and protect vulnerable members of our community. There will be time allotted for questions after she is done speaking. So if you could please just hold your questions until then. Thank you.
Hello, it is wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to start out what I hope is a longer conversation today and over the coming years about how we can prepare ourselves and become a resilient community when faced with this really, really big one. Of course, when we talk the really big one, what we mean is the Cascade Subduction Zone earthquake. This is a quake that could potentially rupture along a 700-mile fault line, everything from Southern California up almost to the tip of North Vancouver Island. This fault line has ruptured in the southern section fairly frequently, a little less frequently along the whole length of the fault. If it does rupture along that whole 700 miles, we're in for potentially a 9.0 magnitude earthquake or bigger. Those are some of the biggest earthquakes ever recorded across the globe. They're really, really big. In our area, lots of geological work suggests they happen perhaps every 400 to 600 years, and the last one that occurred was 316 years ago, almost to the day. So in 2014, I started working with FEMA and with regional experts at the Resilience Institute. Myself and several Resilience Institute staff worked with these experts to create an exercise document. It's called Cascadia Rising, and what it is a summary of what we currently know from all of the research, all of the science, and all of the modeling about what our community's impacts would be with a 9.0 full rupture of this fault line. Now, estimating this kind of stuff is really, really, really hard. It's not like we've had a 9.0 in the Pacific Northwest during a time period where we had all of this infrastructure and all these people. So it's our best guess. But in doing so, we took the worst case scenario because that's what we need to plan for. And so I'm going to share what that worst case scenario looks like. But take it with a grain of salt. It could be worse, it could be better. We can't really model what happens after the event in terms of aftershocks or landslides very well. And so even these estimates could underestimate what we're in for if we have a series of large-scale aftershocks. And everything from other subduction zone earthquakes suggests that we will have quite a few aftershocks, like thousands of aftershocks in the years after this major event, some of them large enough that we would consider them full-on earthquakes. So let's start with the shaking. The earthquake's gonna produce some shaking. It's guaranteed to be regional, very intense, and very prolonged. We're not talking seconds of shaking here, we're talking minutes, 5, 6 minutes of rocking and rolling and rattling. So hold on and be in a safe place and don't try to run because you're probably gonna fall down and hurt yourself. So shaking, location matters. The severest shaking is gonna be along the coast, closest to the fault line, areas like Ocean Shores and Long Beach, Seaside, Aberdeen. Those areas are going to have severe shaking, toppling of chimneys and walls, heavy furniture, heavy damage, even collapse of poorly built structures is estimated for those regions. However, we're pretty far from the fault line, and so somewhat good news is that the Puget Sound Basin is going to have very strong shaking, which there'll be some damage, but considerably less, especially for well-built residential construction, which we all live in. And in our neck of the woods, in Whatcom County, most of the county is going to experience what's considered strong shaking. It's going to be frightening, really, really frightening. But well-built structures will do okay, and for the most part, we're going to survive it. But with a Cascadia subduction zone, the shaking is not the big problem. The tsunami that follows is what is our biggest concern as a region and as a state. I didn't really think much about tsunamis until I went to Japan after their earthquake and tsunamis, and I came back with a very healthy fear of these tsunamis. It's not the Hollywood sort of tidal wave, surfer wave coming in over the tops of buildings. Most of the time, it's this rolling mass of debris and tidal surge that comes up, and it's a wall of water that just moves in and takes out anything in its path. You don't want to be in the inundation zone because even a couple inches will kill you. It'll sweep you off your feet. So the big concerns with this tsunami inundation is, of course, the injuries and fatalities that occur within the inundation zone, but also what happens after. All of the debris that comes in with the wave winds up being deposited in the inundation zone, and that includes hazardous waste. It includes building materials, silt and sand deposits, and these places are very, very hard to recover. So let's look at what we have for Whatcom County, and we've got some pretty good news here. We do have some areas of inundation where people do need to get out, but it's fairly limited. We're talking maybe 15 feet at the highest in the Lummi Reservation area, especially around the Nooksack River and the Lummi River deltas. Some concern down in Padilla Bay. There will be some impacts along the marinas, Sandy Point, Semiahoo, and areas along the coast. But the good news is we're going to have about an hour, maybe longer, before the first waves arrive. And most of the energy from the tsunami is going to slam into the Pacific coast, where the wave heights are extreme, where the inundation comes 15, 30 minutes after the shaking, and where evacuation is going to be very, very problematic, and for some people, impossible. But here, with drilling, with training, with education, and an hour's worth of time and warning, we can get everybody out. We can get everybody to high ground pretty easily. So that's the good news. That said, don't assume that this is your worst case scenario. We could have landslides falling from, say, Lummi Island into the bay, or we could have collapse of the deltas, of the river deltas that cause smaller tsunamis and seiches that would have less warning. So obviously, if there's shaking, you don't want to be by the water. You want to get up and out the minute the shaking stops. Okay, so let's talk about some areas, some impacts of concern, and I'm going to go through 6 areas of concern and talk about what our impacts are, and then we're going to move into what we can do about it. So let's start with population. For Washington as a whole, the estimates, our best guess estimates, are that we're looking at probably 10,000 people with serious injuries and about 10,000 people with fatalities. Most of those fatalities are going to be from the tsunami and are going to be along the Pacific Coast counties. Most of the injuries, however, are going to be from earthquakes and from shaking. And that's going to be glass, puncture wounds. It's going to be heavy furniture falling on you. It's going to be fires that start after the event and burn you, and things that we can prevent with a little bit of work. Within the I-5 corridor, which is the area where the numbers are for us, we're estimating maybe 7,000 injuries, and the fatalities are almost impossible to estimate here. There's about 1,000 people within inundation zones in the upper Puget Sound region, Island County, Skagit, and Whatcom County. All of them do have enough time. If they take a slow walk, they have enough time to walk their way out of the inundation zone. And a slow walk is about the best guess of what is possible. Everyone's going to be fairly dazed. Everyone's going to have rattled and rolled for 6 minutes. And there's going to be a lot of debris. Hopefully it's not dark. and the middle of the night. But at best, people are probably going to be able to do a slow walkout. But we think we can get people out if they're trained and educated to do so. That said, we have about 1,000 people that could potentially be in that inundation zone. That said, timing matters. For an earthquake, the worst time of day is in the afternoons during rush hour, where people are in cars, on transportation routes, or in large stores, grocery stores, where things are going to fall on them, or on sidewalks where parapet collapse and material falling off of buildings can injure them. For a tsunami, the opposite is true. The worst case scenario for tsunamis is, of course, something in the middle of the night, and my worst case scenario, thinking about it, is what if it's during the height of tourist season, say a kite festival down on the coast, where we have a whole lot of visitors who don't understand how and what to do in a tsunami. Let's look at roads. This is the infrastructure that matters the most. Transportation, when we looked at loss estimation, we broke transportation damage into 3 major categories: low, medium, and high. Our low damage, which will show up yellow on the maps, is cosmetic. We'll still be able to use it. We'll have to do some repairs at some point, but it'll be immediately usable. Our medium damage is things that are damaged to the point where it degrades the use of the infrastructure. Perhaps a bridge pier is so damaged that it has to be shored up, or there's an abutment that shifts and cars can't get over the hump and we need a steel plate to use it, or enough damage that we say large and heavy trucks can't use it, and we reduce the capacity of that infrastructure. Those will show up with orange. And then there's the high damage, and that's the stuff that is so damaged that we won't be able to use it afterwards, and we're not going to be able to repair it. It's just going to be too expensive, and we need to actually tear it down and rebuild it before we can use that infrastructure again. So let's look at our map for North Puget Sound. And you can see we've got some good news if we just look at Whatcom County. We do have some areas, some bridges, where we're expecting low and moderate damage. But our biggest concern is that we're not an isolated community. We actually get all of our supplies from down south, and it has to come up pretty much a single transportation route, I-5. And I-5 is going to be a bit of a mess, especially from Everett north through Anacortes. There's going to be quite a few bridges that may have moderate damage and may not be used at full capacity for the weeks, months, maybe even years afterwards. And we all know what that looks like when it's a single bridge that falls into the Skagit River. That delays transportation time to destination quite a bit. It means rerouting is a headache, and it means your big trucks often can't use the alternate routes because they are lower capacity. That was one bridge. Imagine if it's a whole lot of them. We're going to have to get creative with our transportation. But, and Chuckanut Drive. Chuckanut Drive is a little bit of a problem even when there is no earthquake. We have a lot of rock falls on that. So that's our alternate route for I-5, and I don't think we're really going to be able to use that one. But we've got the sea. Maybe we'll get creative with our marine infrastructure. Maybe we'll get creative with seaplanes and helicopters in the the immediate emergency, and then we're just going to have to figure out ways around and create, like we did with OSO, alternate routes. But that'll take a while. The problem is, of course, that roads and highways are the key to everything else. When your electrical lines go down or your substations are damaged, you need a road to go out to find the substation and look at the damage. We can't really repair any of our other infrastructure unless we have a functional transportation. So one of our key first priority is going to be clearing the streets and finding routes that work. Okay, so let's look at electricity. In the minutes after a Cascadia event, pretty certain that we're going to have a regional blackout for all of Western Oregon and Washington, probably even into Eastern Oregon and Washington. The entire system is probably going to lose about half of its load-carrying capacity. And the way the system works, if one section goes down, there's sort of a safety built into it, and other sections close off and shut down so that there isn't an overload. In the I-5 corridor, we're looking at about 10% of the substations and generators having heavy damage. That's enough to cause rolling blackouts and brownouts for the months, perhaps even years afterwards, especially along the coast. The coast may be seeing even more damage and even longer delays in restoration of power. Waste and water systems are also of concern. Many of our pipes are old, and shaking is going to crack them. What that means is you immediately lose water pressure. The reason you want water pressure in your potable water system is so that the sewage doesn't leak into it. Without the pressure, we're going to get commingling of our potable water and our sewage. So much like in Canterbury in New Zealand after their earthquake, we may be under a boil water watch for a very long time because the water out of our tap is unsafe. We may also get raw sewage discharges into our waterways, which is problematic from an ecological standpoint. That said, the I-5 corridor, we're looking at about 10% of that infrastructure having heavy damage, but another half of it probably with moderate damage, enough to make it a little obnoxious for the rest of us. Okay, let's look at hospitals and schools. Hospitals are expected to have a massive influx of patients, those injured survivors, just as they themselves as infrastructure have lost hundreds of critical and regular beds due to damage within the hospitals. The concern is especially the coastal hospitals. They are going to be heavily damaged structurally and have a mass of injuries, and we're going to need to coordinate as a state a pretty mass evacuation of injured survivors into the I-5 corridor hospitals. Some of those will need augmentation and may themselves not be able to handle it, and then probably into Eastern Washington and Oregon as well. We're going to have to work together to make that possible. And the bottom picture here is out of Italy. When their hospitals were damaged, they wound up creating field hospitals in the parking lots in the Palistrades outside of the hospital. That works pretty well in a Mediterranean climate in the summer. It would not work as well today. Our schools are also an area of great concern. Our children are there. About half of the schools may have enough non-structural damage and structural damage that they're unavailable for sheltering, which is problematic. The other problem that can occur is that if transportation routes are down and parents work across town from where their children go to school, we may have trouble reunifying parents and children, and we need to work a lot better. I haven't seen a whole lot of good reunification planning and drilling in Washington State yet. California is doing a pretty good job of this one. Japan does an excellent job. We can do better on this one. It may take months for students to return to school, which has lots of educational loss impacts, stress, and economic impacts. But again, our area is going to be moderately affected by this event, in the relative sense of looking at the coastal communities. What we may need to do is be a support for our coastal communities. We may have an influx of households that come here, and we may be hosting those families, those students, and we need to be prepared for that. So in terms of the numbers only, I-5 corridor, we've got about 25% of the hospitals and about 20% of the schools with high levels of damage that is not immediately functional, perhaps not even repairable. And lastly, housing. This is the one that people are often most concerned about as homeowners or renters. Obviously, anything in the inundation zone is a problem. This is a picture out of Japan, and this is a good picture. This is a picture where there's something to take a picture of. Most of the pictures of the inundation zone, it's just really nothing worth taking a picture of. So housing in that area is highly problematic. Outside of that inundation zone, within just looking at shaking, we have an incredible blessing here in the Pacific Northwest. Most of our homes are built out of highly flexible, durable, and fairly resistant wood construction. On top of that, Whatcom County adopted seismic code regulations that affect residential housing in 1976. And we'll give them a couple years for problematic enforcement, and we'll say anything after 1980 is strapped to its foundation, has shear strength, and is probably going to survive fairly well. The interior contents may be a real problem, and every homeowner and renter needs to deal with it. But for the most part, we're going to have a housing stock that survives this okay. The concern is the older houses. They need to be strapped to their foundation, bolted down. I love old houses. I've got one from 1940. I've done this work myself. It's not that bad. It's doable. Okay, so that's the bad news. Those are the impacts. The good news is a disaster is not inevitable. We can't do anything about the shaking and the tsunami. That's nature. It's just going to happen. But a disaster only happens when that shaking and that inundation happens in a place where a community is vulnerable and not prepared. And that's all within our control. So I want to talk now about what we can do to make the disaster not happen. And what we need for that is a resilient community. And by resilience, I mean a community that is flexible, adaptive, can learn, and can reduce the impacts of their hazards and their vulnerabilities, both before, during, and after an event. So give me a few minutes to talk about what resilience looks like, both in terms of what we've seen in other places and theoretically, and then we'll talk about what we can do here in Whatcom County. Okay, so let's start with what matters. And surprisingly, what matters is not the roads and the bridges and the electricity and the houses and even the sheer survival of the population. If we have all that and we are absolutely miserable, that's not what we want. What we want is individual and community well-being. That's our ultimate goal. And what I mean by that is a community that is healthy, that is secure, that has its material needs met, where people have a sense of satisfaction and connection and have an ability to be involved in the political and cultural processes that make their life meaningful. Disasters generally undermine all of that if we're not careful. So let's look at what happens. And there's, looking at disasters around the world, 3 things generally happen after a disaster. There's sort of 3 trajectories. The first is resistance. And this is when you have a small event, say a moderate-sized earthquake or a winter storm or a single bridge collapse. Communities can generally resist those events fairly effectively if they have robust and redundant infrastructure, human resources, and services. They just sort of power through it. There's a little bit of disruption, but then quickly those services are restored, and any stress or negative impacts on individuals and communities from that loss of service is sort of quickly restored. That works for smaller events. We saw that with the bridge collapse. We saw that with this building here. This building burnt to the ground. My daughter was in middle school when it happened, but within a week, educational services were restored, and the psychological impact, yeah, she'll remember it, but it wasn't negative for the rest of her life. However, what happens when you got a bigger event? that big one, the really big one. When that happens, guaranteed, you're going to have some amount of transient dysfunction. There's going to be some period of time that you're in an emergency stage and where the services just aren't there, where the power is off, where the schools are shut down, where businesses are not open, where supplies aren't getting in and out, where we're all in that emergency phase. But then the question is, how do we recover from that? And there's two paths out of that transient dysfunction that research and experience show. The first is the one we don't want, and that's communities that are vulnerable. Communities that are vulnerable, and the vulnerability is something that is pre-disaster. That's when the community has non-redundant, non-robust infrastructure, when they have social networks that are thin, when they have political dysfunction, when they've got human resources that are fragile or so thin that they're just barely coping without the disaster, where everything is just stretched thin. When you've got that community and you add on that natural hazard, that major, major big one, what you get is a loss of services, and sometimes a loss of services forever, or for very long periods of time, years and even decades, where the education system, for instance, falls apart, or where the major employer in the region pulls out and isn't able to recover, or where people just acting with each other, you lose the goodwill between groups. And what happens there is maladaptive response. The rates of PTSD, the rates of depression, the rates of alcoholism, divorce, domestic violence skyrocket in these communities. You have reduced family cohesion. You have increased disparities. The communities, or the parts of the community that were struggling beforehand, struggle even more. And while the well-off parts of the community are able to recover, the other parts of the community lag behind, and you get further disparities. The people who have social connections and have highly employable skills figure out ways to move out and stay out, and you get an out-migration. We saw that in Sendai in Japan. There was a sharpening of the depopulation of the affected area, and you get an economic hollowing out of your community, all things that we don't want to see. I was in Nepal this summer looking at school safety and a whole bunch of other things. But I spent the summer in communities in Nepal, and certainly in the one particular rural community and remote community in Rasua, I saw this happening. They had the transient dysfunction. They lost their housing. They grouped together after the event, and they pulled off the plastic sheeting that was used on, what do you call it? I'm losing my words. The plastic sheeting you use on agricultural frames, greenhouses, thank you. They pulled that off, and they created temporary structures to restore housing. A big storm came through, blew it all away down the mountainside, and the mountain is like this, so you lose it, and you never find it again. And then they really didn't have any resources, because they were so stretched thin even beforehand, to repair and create viable structures. They salvaged some of the tin roofing and created temporary structures, but this is in the high mountain regions, and a structure where you've got tin roof and tin walls in the middle of the Himalayas in winter is not the same. It's not providing appropriate housing. They lost their housing. And we could see the maladaptive behavior starting to crop up there in the children and in the adults. The other option, the more hopeful option, is to move from transient dysfunction to resilience. And certainly, it's restoring all of the community services, I'll bet, is in a different environment. The world is a changed place, your community is a changed place, and so what those services look like may be very different. And I'll give you an example to make this make sense. New Orleans universities did this really well. New Orleans universities were hit very, very hard by Hurricane Katrina. They were damaged to the point that students could not return to campus in the weeks after the hurricane. So the universities got together with universities from across the country, and they created a program that gave students, survivors from Katrina, the funds and the option to transfer to any school, host school in the United States where their education was covered, and they spent a semester at their host institution. At the end of that host institution semester, they were given the choice to stay at the host institution, whether that be in Texas or New Jersey or anywhere in between, or they were given the chance to return to New Orleans. Many, many students did return to New Orleans, and when they came back, their education services remained, but it looked really, really different. There were no dorm rooms, and so what they did, and this is the creativity and flexibility that I want to see here in our community, they took the cruise ships along the Mississippi River, and they commandeered them. They bought it out. It's not like the tourists were coming to town anytime soon. And they took the cruise ships and turned them into dorm rooms. The hotels that had used to function for the major conventions and the tourists coming in, they didn't have any clients. They turned those into classrooms. And the universities took over the Hilton. And yeah, it wasn't perfect. It's really hard to have a class in a convention center with only sort of partition walls. The students complained about the noise, and it was hard, but it worked. The teachers turned their classes around, and instead of focusing on their standard curriculum, almost all the classes turned into service learning programs, and they got out into the communities to reduce disparities and help communities that were struggling get back on their feet. The education they got, I think, was probably a better education than the one they would have gotten before the disaster. I think we can do things like that. So the big question is, how do we do this? How can we as individuals and as a community here build community resilience? And I have a little asterisk here because I want to remind myself and others that when we talk about resilience, the one trap we don't want to fall into is putting resilience only on individuals and households and communities. The primary responsibility for a safe and functioning community does still fall on local and state government. They're the ones that can make sure that the infrastructure is robust, that the policies are disaster conscientious, and that services are equitably distributed. But for the most part, you all are not policymakers, and that's a conversation for another day. So I will set that aside and just focus on what we can do as individuals. Now, firstly, of course, we can all engage in disaster preparedness. I'm going to let the panel discussion that we have in a bit do most of that work and most of that conversation. But I do want to point out that obviously knowing and drilling what to do in an earthquake and in a tsunami is vitally important. Having your emergency supplies and your go kits is going to save lives and certainly reduce a whole lot of misery after a disaster. But while that is important, and while I want to stress that, my biggest concern is not actually the couple days and weeks after. Yeah, that's going to be awful. But what I have seen in all of my research and all of my post-disaster reconnaissance work is that we've got years and decades of recovery, and we need to be creating resilience because we need that process to work well. So let's talk about what we can do to make sure we're resilient and we can recover resiliently from this event. First is obviously infrastructure. We need to have robust infrastructure. Now, individuals usually aren't in charge of this, but there is something all of us as individuals can do. We can ensure that our policymakers have this on their agenda. We can push. We can make sure that when the school bond or the bridge bond or the hospital bonds, or, well, hospitals don't have bonds, but when public infrastructure needs funding, that we're supporting that investment and those retrofit projects because we need robust infrastructure. At the household level, we also need to be making sure our infrastructure is robust. And there's a couple key things we need to do. We need to make sure that all the houses built before 1980 are bolted to their foundation. I did this a couple years ago for my house, and it's a couple $1,000s and a week of dust and headache, but it's not that bad. We can make sure that chimneys are secured and they don't fall down through our roofs or onto our neighbors. I have to admit, I have to do this one still. We can all make sure that our water tanks are strapped to the wall. Hot water tanks, especially those that have natural gas heating, can become a major fire hazard, and the fire department's not coming to put out your fire, I promise you. So you don't want to have a house fire after an earthquake. So strap that thing down, and we can make sure our heavy and valuable furniture is strapped down as well, so that injuries are reduced, because the hospitals, they're going to be overwhelmed. You really need to not have an injury. We can also build an adaptive economy. And by this, I mean a very diverse economy. Yeah, buy local, think local, support your local businesses. Local businesses after disasters. The research on economic recovery is kind of spotty, but what it does show is local businesses are usually the first to open after a disaster, because they are committed to their community. It's them. And they want to open, they want to help support their community, and they want to survive this. So they open quickly and are incredibly supportive. That said, many of them are overwhelmed. Maybe their entire asset base is in the affected area. Many of them go out of business. So while it's like, yeah, local, also, yay, box stores, big box stores. Go big box stores too. We need both of those together. The big box stores often don't open as quickly, but are often able to recover because they can rely on assets outside of the affected area, and they can bring in supplies eventually. So we need both of those together. And we just plain need a diverse economy, because we don't know what's going to work after a disaster. And if we've got lots of balls in the air, one or two of them is going to work. So support a diverse economy, and then, whether you're an employee or a business owner, do your business continuity planning. Do it regularly, update it, talk about it at work. The Washington State has great tools for this, including the Disaster Resistant Business Toolkit. Nationally, we have Open for Business. All of these are available online and are great places to start. Let's make sure our businesses are thinking through how to be able to survive these events. And lastly, support the schools. It's really interesting, but if you don't have the schools come back quickly, you're not going to have an economy that recovers. People are going to move out of your area because they want their kids in school, and they can't go to work if they've got kids at home. So young families often leave an area if the school doesn't recover, which tanks the economy. So let's make sure our schools are prepared. Push for the school in your neighborhood. The other thing we can do to increase resilience is exactly what we're doing now, which is we need to practice together. We need to practice emergency response. We need to do CERT. We need to do Map Your Neighborhood. We need to do the Volunteer Center, which is helping support this event. We need to just volunteer, because it's those volunteer activities that build the skills and the networks that we will have to rely on, and we need those to be robust, not fragile and frayed. We also need to make sure that politically we're learning to work together and be flexible and adaptive and able to compromise, because post-disaster, that is what helps a community recover. And lastly, we need to build social capital. All the evidence points to households and communities recovering quicker with less negative psychological impact when they have strong social networks. That is, strong social networks within their groups, but then good, strong links between social groups. Things like religious organizations, cultural events, neighborhood associations, campaigns, that all builds social capital. Go hold a block party. You're helping prepare for a disaster. Go hold a Map Your Neighborhood party. That's even better. Map your neighborhood, gets you together with your neighbors, gets you to meet and talk with your neighbors and build trust among your neighbors. And those are the people that are your first responders. Those are the people that are going to help you in the days after the emergency, and the people that you're going to want to recover for. Get to know them, figure out who's vulnerable, figure out who's got skills and resources, figure out where all the gas mains are and how to turn them off, and everybody promise to put their fire extinguishers out on the street and share them so that your community doesn't go up in fire afterwards. These are things that all build connection and community, and that's exactly what we need. A community that has created deep and wide social networks, strong competency, a strong, robust economy, and a sense of belonging are the communities that are going to support us physically and emotionally after an event, and the kind of communities that we're going to want to pitch in for and even fight for in the recovery process when we're faced with that long slog, not of the days afterwards, but of the years and even decades after of recovery. And I just have to say, as my last thing, I'm looking out at all of you here, hundreds of people, on a Saturday morning at that. And it gives me incredible hope. I haven't felt so hopeful about Whatcom County resilience as I have felt right now. If we work together and if we all chip in and volunteer now, I think we got this.
In one of your first slides, you had a statistic where the earthquake probability seems to be recurring every 400 to 500 years. And I know Oregon had released a video saying it was more like 250 to 300 years.
That's, and Jackie, nod your head if I'm saying this correctly, I'm not a geologist. That's the recurrence interval for the southern break of the Cascade Subduction Zone, which will create an earthquake around an 8.0 magnitude event and affect mostly Oregon and Southern California, although we'll feel it. Northern California, sorry, yeah.
Can you define for us how far inland the coast is considered? And when we are talking to people who live up on bluffs like Marine Drive and Lummi Shore Road, when they tell us that they're safe and aren't going to evacuate, how to convince them that perhaps it would be a good idea?
Okay, so there's two questions there. How far in does the coast, when we did the statistics, the coast is all of the counties along the peninsula. And then I-5 corridor is the Puget Sound. No, when we're talking the coastal communities, in terms of the statistics we did here, that is all of the counties from the Pacific all the way into, say, Olympia. And that area is expected to have really high levels of damage. 101, the Highway 101, gone. Just, it's going to be gone. In terms of inundation, which may be more of your question, how far inland the tsunami will come, it depends very much on the bathymetry, the way that the seafloor works, the way that the topography works. We have tsunami inundation maps produced by DNR, Department of Natural Resources, available for all the coastal communities, and you have to look each one up individually and see where that inundation is. The biggest areas of concern are Westport, Long Beach, and Aberdeen. Aberdeen, they can get out. Ocean Shores, there's not a real good way to evacuate those areas. Jackie has...
Since you asked specifically about Marine Drive and things like this, sometimes people think, when they're concerned about tsunami, are you talking about tsunami inundation? Yeah, when we're talking about tsunami inundation, you see movies or you see video from Japan and all that where you have really exceptionally high waves. That, as Rebeka rightly pointed out, is really isolated to the coastal areas where they receive the full brunt of that initial wave. When you're talking in the bay, we're not expecting tsunami heights that exceed more than a couple of meters. So the hazard to communities that are up on a bluff, like out on Marine Drive, is likely not from the inundation. There could potentially be landslide hazard there. And again, Rebeka will probably know more than I about, whether there's been, I'm not sure if there's been any work on that issue. But people up on the bluff, really to get away from the water, you don't have to go that high. You really don't have to go that high, and that's really fortunate for us from an evacuation perspective, that particularly in our areas here, we have not a lot of lowland around the bay, so we can get to high coast pretty easily.
If we can get 50 feet up, we're okay. So they're fine. The people of concern are people, say, living on boats in the marina, people on Lummi Reservation on Slater Road, and people Sandy Point. Those people need to get out, but we've got the time to do that.
What kind of special outreach is going out to the minority communities who are likely to be the most vulnerable?
That I'm going to pass off to the panel discussion because I think they're going to answer that better than I. But I thank you for bringing up that issue because it's easy to get very individualistic about all this in my house and my personal safety. But what we really need is a community where everybody does well, because if one part of our community is vulnerable and experiences extreme loss, they'll have maladaptive behavior, and it's not good for them, and it's not good for us, and it's not good for our community.
Good morning. Thanks for coming and speaking to us this morning. A lot more households in our neighborhood and probably throughout Whatcom County now have solar panels. Have you seen any adaptation of the use of solar panels or preparation for the adaptation so that we could sort of flip a switch and be able to use the power that we generate from that as a
I'm not
response?
an expert in this area, but I bet there is somebody in the room that is. Obviously, if you've got a system set up so that you have the battery backup for storing that energy, yes, you'll be able to use it again, which is great.
Do you know if we need to drive north, how they handle things at the border crossing?
I don't think anyone, yeah, somebody probably knows that. Okay, emergency managers down there know how to answer that. We'll do it in the
Okay,
panel.
thanks.
Remind us if we don't.
Most neighborhoods have some student rentals. Some are highly saturated. Students turn over. How do we organize that? How do we organize them? How do we coordinate with the university so that we can have a resilient response instead of a scattered one?
This is one of our big vulnerable populations for all the reasons that you have suggested. These are young people who are away from their families with limited resources and really no institutional memory. And certainly they're just, sort of flailing around learning to be adults.
Their community is the university. It is not the neighborhoods that they live in.
Is not the neighborhoods they live in. First of all, property owners, we can work hard to make sure that property owners have done their mitigation. We don't need a water tank falling over in a rental property and a student not knowing how to use a fire extinguisher and setting an entire neighborhood on fire.
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
So let's make sure that our property owners have done their due diligence and made for safe environments. We've got quite a few students on campus in my program and in Jackie's program who are working in the CERT volunteer. Yay. We're starting to work with the Red Cross, and one of our primary objectives is going to be building awareness in the student population.
Thank you.
But the problem is they keep leaving. Every time you've educated them, they graduate.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A concern of mine is, do our infrastructure that is being developed along the waterfront, the old Georgia Pacific plant, and the area of the Bellwether, which is all on landfill and will turn to liquid,
Yeah.
is this being addressed?
Not that I know of. It's not my idea of the safest development plan.
It's a big deal.
It is a big deal. It's a great place for some open space and parks.
Hey. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
My question kind of goes along those lines. Do you know how much of Whatcom County is built on fill?
If you want to know that, our state is amazing in terms of infrastructure or information resources. There's this website called the Geological Portal. put out by DNR, and you can get in there and you can turn on maps that'll show you exactly where the liquefaction zones are. In fact, out on the information tables, I had a flyer out there, and one of the things that I suggested people go look at was the Washington State seismic catalog. And you can get into that seismic catalog. Some students and I worked on creating that porthole a couple years ago. And once you're in there, you can turn on any earthquake we're expecting in Washington State, and you can just look, and you can say, what's a Seattle fault break look like for Bellingham? What's a Cascadia break look like for Bellingham? What's a Devil's Mountain break look like, or a North Woodby Island break? And there's a way that you can go down and drill down and turn on the soils feature. Turn it on. It takes forever to load because it's a lot of data, but be patient, and it'll pull up a map that you can see exactly where the liquefaction zones are. And if we've got good urban and regional planners, which I have to say Whatcom County does pretty well with, but let's push them even further, they should have made sure that those zones are not high development zones, that we don't have a lot of infrastructure there. Canterbury in New Zealand, their downtown area was liquefiable, and they've basically hollowed out their downtown. They've got a donut now, and you can't, they don't know how to recover the mill.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we are fortunate enough that she will stay for the town hall. Right now, what we want to do is take a 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we will get all of the folks from the other organizations and up here, and we'll have them introduce themselves and so forth. Then we'll start a discussion, town hall discussion. That's where we're going to focus our time on. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started with our panel and a town hall discussion. And what I'm going to do is just ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves and just briefly identify, which organization they represent. And then after that has been completed, we'll do, the same format we did earlier, where we will ask people to come down to the microphones and pose their question, and any of the panel members can opt to take on that question if it's within their area of expertise. And I also was made aware that, yes, there are people who are up in the balcony that may want to be wandering down here to ask questions, and it could take them a little bit longer to get down. So I want to be respectful, give everybody an opportunity, but we will be taking turns from the mics. Okay, so I will start at the end, even though
I'm Rebeka Paci-Green. I am an assistant professor up at Western Washington University teaching in environmental studies and natural hazards planning. I also am director of the Resilience Institute and work most extensively internationally on school safety in Asia.
Can you hear me okay? Yep, okay. My name is Prentice Andrews. I'm an AmeriCorps service member serving with American Red Cross here in Bellingham. And you guys are probably all familiar with the Red Cross. We do a lot of different things. Most folks think of us as a disaster response agency, but we really do a lot more than that. Service to armed forces, blood collection, home fire. We're doing outreach, trying to get free smoke detectors into homes in the community. And we also do preparedness education, and that's really my full-time job, is bringing preparedness education to the community. There was a question a few minutes ago about what efforts are being done to bring that information to students and to minorities specifically. We are trying to bring it to everyone, but I need help doing that. So if that's something that other people are also concerned about, if you're interested, that's something we're trying to do, and we'd love to have your help bringing that information to the community. Just want to remind folks, we're more than 90% volunteer organization, so we really rely on folks to come give us a hand doing all of the different things that we do. I'd like to make a couple of separate points. I'm an AmeriCorps service member. I'm also a Red Cross volunteer. So I work full-time with the Red Cross, but I don't work for the Red Cross. So I'm not in a position to speak for the Red Cross, but I can tell you all about the things that we're doing here in the community and all the things that I'm up to trying to help the community get better prepared. The other point that I want to make is that I think people have a perception that we're a very large organization. We're sort of monolithic and impersonal. And it's easy to see why that happens because most of what you see on TV is us responding to large-scale disasters. And we do that. But the vast majority of our work is done in the community, and you don't see that on television. So we have a team of folks on call 24 hours a day, and we mostly respond to home fires and floods. We average one a week. So this is by the numbers. This is the bigger mission for us is helping folks in the community. And you know, if there's a fire in your neighborhood and one of your neighbors is there on the street trying to figure out what to do next, you know, we don't fly the CEO in from Washington, D.C. to help that person. It's the people that are sitting next to you. There are a number of Red Cross volunteers here in the room today. These are the people that respond. So my hope is that going forward, we can kind of think of the Red Cross activities here in the community as local people using the national access to resources to help other local people. It's really a local organization in application. So thanks.
And my name is Greg Hope. I'm the program manager for your Whatcom CERT program. Since 1999, Whatcom CERT has trained over 1,000 Whatcom residents to function safely and effectively as emergency responders. Our first responders in this community are sitting right here in this room. It's you. When a large-scale disaster happens, our professional first responders are going to be fully occupied. They're going to be doing what we hope they do, and that is they're going to be responding to the areas of greatest need, greatest damage, greatest vulnerability. And so what's left after that? What's left are our trained fellow residents who are able to care for ourselves and care for the members of the community nearest to us. We deliver an 8-week training program that prepares our volunteers to function effectively and safely in areas like preventing and extinguishing small fires, conducting light search and rescue, conducting triage and providing field medical support for victims, and of course preparedness and hazard mitigation. We do it all at a remarkably low cost, and our courses fill up very quickly. Our first course for this year is starting in February, and we have courses starting up as well in June and September. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment and just ask you all to look around the room, and I'd like to ask, if you are a CERT volunteer, either from Whatcom County or from out of state, or if you're one of our wonderful CERT instructors, please stand right now and be recognized by your community members. And a few of us will be around at the end of these proceedings as well to answer any more questions that you have about the program or to help you get registered for an upcoming course.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Gattenbein, and please excuse my voice. I'm just recovering from a cold, so bear with me on this. But I'm here to represent Map Your Neighborhood. It's a Washington State management program that will get you and your neighborhood and your neighbors prepared to respond to a disaster when it occurs. First of all, you'll learn how to create a spreadsheet to understand the skills and equipment that your neighbors have to offer, as well as what you have to offer in a disaster. It'll go through the 9 steps of what you immediately do when a disaster hits, both yourself and your family, and then into your neighborhood. And then the last one will be to create maps, locations of where your neighbors are, locations of shutoffs for water, gas, electricity. And then there's also many links to how to create a mapping neighborhood. And it was on the handout table as you signed in. So if you do really want to get interested in Map Your Neighborhood, how to organize, this handout will help you quite a bit in getting started on that. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Gazdick. I am the City of Bellingham's emergency manager and member of Whatcom Unified. I would like to thank the three gentlemen to my right, as they are all representative of volunteer agencies. So that makes about 50% of this panel representing volunteer agencies, which I think is fantastic. New to the area, so learning right along with you about the hazards within Whatcom County and our region, and excited to be part of the Pacific Northwest response. Thank you.
I'm Shalise Dew Johnson. I'm with Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, Division of Emergency Management. Like Paul, part of the Whatcom Unified Emergency Management, working with the Volunteer Center to establish these volunteer mobilization centers, because we know that recovery, responding to and recovering from a disaster can't be done with our staff. So we're looking to work with the Volunteer Center to establish these centers to help us with those spontaneous,
Documented, unregistered.
unregistered, unaffiliated volunteers. So.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm John Gargett. I'm the Deputy Director for Emergency Management, Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. Bill Elfo did want to be here today. He unfortunately did have another public meeting that he needed to attend this morning, but he asked me to say he hopes everybody gets involved. He's heavily devoted to emergency management. I actually started in 1980, May 18th, 1980. How many know that date? That's when I went into the profession full-time. In 83 and 84, I actually had the same job here in Whatcom County, and then spent about 32 years, well, actually I did spend 32 years traveling around the world, doing planning, mitigation, and response to major events and disasters of all types worldwide, ranging from Somalia to Japan to working in war environments such as Croatia and the events there, natural disasters, hazardous materials, just a whole series. So I'm quite happy to be back here. I've been here about 6 weeks now, I think, Paul. Paul's the experienced man in our office.
7 months. 7 months.
But I do want to also recognize, though, Francis Burkhart of our office, who could not be here today, and Shalise, both of whom have been here for 10-plus years. And they were kidding Paul and I the other day, saying, well, on average, you guys are going to be here about 2 years. So hopefully longer, Shalise. And by the way, I promised Shalise I wouldn't do this, but I think it's worthwhile to note she comes from a long line of emergency management. Her father was one of the top experts in emergency management in the state of Washington. He worked for the state, he worked for FEMA. Shalise has worked for FEMA. And last month, she was the recipient of the Sheriff's Commendation Award for meritorious service. Getting back to Whatcom County and some of the issues that we have here, and I know we'll open it up to the panel for questions, but a couple things did come up. Crossing the border and going into Canada. Actually wrote the cross-border response plan. That's in the process of being updated this year. There are some changes. We can talk more about that. The question of minorities came up. I have worked also with the Lummi Nation, Nooksack tribe, and others here, and wrote their plan as well. And there are a host of other areas here in the community who have taken planning very seriously, including the Ferndale School District, WTA, the Port of Bellingham, and so on. So with that, I don't need to go on. I think, what's the format here?
Thank you, everybody. Is there anybody that would like to step forward to the mic and ask the panel any kind of a question that they may have?
I'm really not ready. These are my questions. Almost a third of Whatcom County is retired. So that means Social Security checks, pension checks, access to 401k. So while our jobs are not going away, what's the process for us to be able to access funds? And that means electronic. So the banks being opened, you know, I'm assuming DC will be intact, but how are we going to access that money?
The question was, especially for the senior population, which relies on checks such as Social Security checks and other monies that come from either the federal government or retirement, in the event of a major event, how will they have access to those funds? Did I state that correctly? Yes. Thank you. I guess since I'm talking, I'll kind of address that. We did do some work on this last year. First of all, I think now it's required by Social Security that you receive your funds electronically, which means there may be some small exceptions to that, but generally that's the case. So, which means that all the banks had to agree under federal legislation that those funds get deposited in there. Now, that doesn't get to the question of how you obtain or get to that in the event of something happening. And there are a number of ways to do that. But if you're with a large bank, Bank of America, let's say, you can still do your online banking, assuming you can get an internet connection. I grant you that. But those funds are in there. Anything you can set up ahead of time as an auto withdrawal against those funds will continue on and are supposed to continue on in the event of a disaster. So those programs are there. For those that receive funds from a retirement account, again, I would suggest you look at the electronic deposit into your banks. And go to your bank if you have a smaller bank. I bank at WECU, for example, and ask to see what their plans are in the event of a disaster. Do not hesitate to ask that. I know WECU is happy to share what they're doing.
The only other thing I would say to that is diversity, diversity, diversity. Have a local and a national bank, and have some cash on hand.
Right, I'll expand on that for a moment because we talk a lot about folks putting kits together so they have access to supplies and resources in the event of emergency. And there are a couple of common items that lots of people, including myself, didn't think about beforehand. And so having cash is one of them for that exact reason. If you don't have access to your funds, even for a limited amount of time, that could be problematic. And the other ones are medication and access to important documents, whatever that might be for your situation. If they're stored digitally in particular and you need access to them in the event of emergency, then you better have a plan for how to get them, unless you can keep some copies of them on paper form ahead of time. And then, of course, what was mentioned earlier was fuel. So if you're expecting that part of your response is going to be to use a generator, a car, or whatever it is, have you thought about how much fuel you're going to need and how long you may go without access to that? So those are the common items that we see that people don't always think of when they're building their kits.
My question is, as a volunteer CERT, Red Cross experience, and working with my religious group to develop a disaster preparedness plan, where should I be looking to get my instructions in case of an event? Which group, or would the volunteer group be the place that I look to?
When you say instruction, do you mean instructions to deploy and activate, or are you talking about additional training?
To activate.
It's something that we're working on now. Our CERT graduates are familiar with the idea that in the event of an incident, our first priorities, of course, are to confirm our own safety, the safety of our families, and then our neighbors nearby. And the question comes up, has come up before, well, then what comes next? In many jurisdictions, our CERT graduates are simply told, well, you all convene at your predetermined staging location and then carry out the duties as you've learned going through class. One of my big objectives for this year for the Whatcom County CERT program is to connect all of our graduates that are out there. You all need to know where each other is located and get you working as teams, and it is my goal to establish effective and well understood working relationships between our CERT teams and the fire stations that serve the areas that they're in. The point is that our trained volunteers are a tremendous asset to the community, and our government agencies and our local professional responders look at you in that way and want to know that you're there. You might be called upon by fire staff for specific duties, or you might actually be told, carry out the protocols of your training, and in that case, be self-directed. So over this coming year, members of our local CERT teams are going to be hearing from the CERT program to bring you all together and help you to really clearly understand what your protocols are when the big bad thing happens. Does that answer that question?
Yes, thank you.
It was also my understanding that as part of this presentation that we're having here today, the check-in process that went through, this is kind of the first step for the Volunteer Mobilization Center. Is that correct, Mal? And trying to kind of identify how we're going to start that process, and this is kind of that building block that we'll continue to build as we go through.
I'd also like to make a small point from the international arena. I am CERT certified and trained in Turkey, where I lived for several years. And what we found there is, yeah, it's a good plan to post-event meet up with your CERT team and start to mobilize. But reality is, you're going to be stretched thin. You might not be able to reach your group. Really, you're the leader. And you're going to form a team around you of volunteers in your neighborhood or wherever you happen to be, and you're going to train them, and you're going to start working. And just do it.
I'd also like to add, when it comes to a response to a disaster, Whatcom Unified activates our Emergency Operations Center, where there are priorities identified based on the impacts to the community. It's through that we might identify a need for volunteers, and we would call upon our emergency workers that are pre-established and are affiliated with, let's say, Greg talked about his CERT graduates, so affiliated with CERT. They might be affiliated with Search and Rescue. That is another large volunteer population that is part of the emergency worker program. That's all stuff that happens before a disaster strikes. We get people connected with volunteer units, and you can go through a registration process and be part of the emergency worker program that provides liability coverage through the state of Washington, the WAC, Washington Administrative Code. I won't go into any additional numbers related to that, but it provides you that liability coverage. So, you know, what we're doing now is we're trying to connect with the community and let you know, we need you. We need you. And let's get you registered ahead of time. Let's get you attached with an organization that exists to get you the training that you would need to be effective and efficient in a disaster response.
One of Rebecca's points in her talk was the bridges falling down on I-5 and not being able to get our food from the south. And the other alternative would be get our food from the north. And how much coordination are all of you folks doing with Canada? Because Vancouver is closer, and it's also pretty much flat between here and there.
Yes, it's primarily flat because it's all liquefaction zone.
And they are going to have a
Now,
major disaster in British Columbia,
Yeah,
even bigger than us, and they have less resources.
yeah, and I'll add those specifically in answer to your question. We work very closely. In fact, we just had our planning meeting for the Cascadia Rising exercise for June. We had Delta, Surrey, Langley, Abbotsford, and Chilliwack all attend, and we attend their meetings as well. Rebecca is absolutely spot on. We think we could drive north, and things will be great. In fact, all the models that Rebecca and Jackie have show that all the shaking stops at the border. It's really amazing. But unfortunately, it doesn't. And they are going to be, as Rebecca said, more impacted than we are. But we are working with them. In Cascadia Rising, we're actually exchanging people in our EOCs.
And not to belabor and turning it back, but one of the things that we are also looking at doing is the community points of distribution. This came out of Hurricane Sandy, of setting up regional places for people to have distribution points, which didn't work because of what you're highlighting with the roads and bridgeways not being passable. So we've identified 6 five or six places. We also have community points of distribution training that people can go through to set up these what are called C-pods. So that's another option or avenue onto which to get valuable resources into the community.
Yeah, my question is, we were talking about disasters today, and I'm just curious if there are programs available for the volunteers for, say, terrorism activity or things along that nature, where it's, in the world that we're facing today, there's more of that kind of thing.
We take an all-hazards approach. And in fact, one of the strategies of resilience, one of the main points of resilience, is that it really doesn't matter what the event is. It's how do you respond to it. So you can almost take earthquake out, insert terrorism, take terrorism out, insert hazardous materials. There are unique things with each type of event, granted. However, the fundamental way that you would, things you do, take care of yourself, take care of your neighbors, take care of your neighborhood, take care of your community, remain. Instructions may be different. Again, to build on what Rebeka said, though, I think one of the best areas to deal with is the school systems. And so I would say, you know, that's an area that's open for volunteerism, and I would argue that a school shooting is an act of terrorism. We can argue the fine points, you know, whether it's an international act or not, doesn't really matter. If you're prepared for that type of event and all the schools are actively working on that, then you're going to be better prepared.
I can give you a little more expansion on that as well. Our CERT curriculum does include a unit on terrorism, and over the whole range of incidents that you could come in contact with, there are some things that our volunteer responders take an active part in, and there are others that are beyond their scope. And we tell them, you don't approach this. If a fire is too big, or if it's an act of terrorism, or if it's a hazardous materials event, we simply do things like maintain a perimeter, monitor, and report. And so we do provide some education so that people really understand what they're talking about when the word terrorism is used. So it's addressed in the curriculum, but our volunteers won't find themselves taking an active role in that particular kind of an incident.
I guess I was wondering if there were programs available for learning what to do, because a lot of us travel, we're at airports, we're not in our community. And if something happens in an environment where we happen to be at that time, so is there anything that is available either online or whatever to learn about how to be aware, what to do, so we can help others, help ourselves in a situation like that?
A couple things. One, if you are CERT certified, CERT card is pretty much universally recognized nationwide. So if you carry your CERT card and you are in another community and something does happen, you'll 99% of the time be recognized as somebody who has skills that they'll be able to use locally. So carry your card. It may sound simplistic, but that's one thing to do. Public service announcements, of course, finding out when you go somewhere what radios are the public service radios, et cetera, and so on. Some of the unique nature of what happens with terrorism and all that, I want to echo what Greg said. The role may not be actually going in and doing anything at the scene because it's a crime scene. But I know from Oklahoma City when we were there, I was there for the first 3 days, CERT teams were the ones that were actually on the perimeter providing crowd control, traffic direction, and helping get the food that was being donated into us that were inside the perimeter. So simply doing that would be a big help.
And if you're talking about traveling internationally, the U.S. State Department website is a good source of information, and registering with the United States State Department in the location where you are is a good step.
Thank you. I've got two comments/questions. The first one has to do with a number of initial casualties, and I spoke a bit with Dr. I can't say her
Paci-Green.
Thank you, about this, but there's going to be second and third order effects there, and particularly with the elderly and the disadvantaged, and it could be really demoralizing to literally, you're not pulling the plug, there's not electricity there, but if someone needs oxygen to survive, how do we as a community have resilience for that? What can we physically we can do what we can, but mentally we need to be ready for that. And I'm wondering if any of you can speak to that.
I can, because that's been a big issue. Frankly, Whatcom County does not have a large health infrastructure. So if we look at the number of casualties of even a moderate type of an event, the ER at St. Joe's, for example, can only handle 20 people before it's overloaded. So just imagine that, multiply it out. Skagit County is an hour-and-a-half round trip in a best scenario. So you're taking an ambulance and equipment out of service. About the only way we can really deal with things is fly people out. We do have, there is a Washington State and provincial BC cross-border emergency health plan. But again, we have to plan for, and those of us in this community are planning for the fact that Vancouver's going to be more affected than we are. So they're going to be flown out, probably out of Bellingham Airport.
Thank you. I may not have been clear enough. I'm not talking about what necessarily would be an emergency, but someone with a chronic illness like COPD.
Okay,
Someone who-
so
Go ahead.
for chronic illnesses, this is where Map Your Neighborhood and CERT training and simply working with your neighborhood is going to be incredibly effective. If your neighborhood has multiple people who are on medical equipment that requires electricity, perhaps you should all work together to find a generator and the backup fuel and agree that, okay, we're going to bring everyone with medical needs that needs electricity to the one neighbor that has those resources. You have to start planning for this stuff at the individual household and community level.
You can also, my mother passed last year, and hospice was in helping her. Wonderful job, great group hospice. But I actually asked them, because she had oxygen and some necessary drugs. I said, can you double that quantity and just have it there in case we have an earthquake? And they, believe it or not, they were like, absolutely, no problem. So if anybody's on breathing support equipment or anything like that, I don't know of any doctor, or certainly hospice, more than willing, by experience, to give you extra supplies just in case. May only make a few days, but it helps.
Thank you.
I may add too on that, Map Your Neighborhood would be a perfect project for you. You'd all know where your neighbors or needs are, and you can address it right away. So that Map Your Neighborhood steps right into that.
Thank you, and can people hear me?
Yeah.
The second question is, I realize this is a subduction zone earthquake-focused talk, but we have a local earthquake hazard, and I'm hoping Jackie can speak to that a bit. We've got the Boulder-Kendall Fault in the area. May not result in a tsunami, but it could be minutes of shaking locally, very hard shaking.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to chat with that. Just for the record, my name is Jackie Kaplan-Auerbach, and I'm a seismologist at Western, which is why he's asking me to step into this. Yeah, we do actually have in this area, we actually have sort of three predominant seismic hazards. We hear a lot about the Great Cascadia, the megathrust, right, the magnitude 9. That would be our broadest reaching, largest magnitude earthquake we would expect. But we also have two other hazard zones. How many people here experienced an Nisqually earthquake in 2001? Probably a pretty decent number. That's actually our most common seismic hazard in this area, obviously more localized to the southern Puget Sound, but we get those type of earthquakes, pretty repetitive style of earthquake, high magnitude 6, but considerably deeper. Those initiate at 50, 60 kilometers below ground. That's the most common one we get. In some respects, it is one of our lower hazards because it is deeper. That makes it somewhat less violent ground shaking. Deeper earthquakes are rarely associated with significant aftershock activity. But again, that's the most common type. But then this gentleman mentioned these crustal earthquakes. We have earthquakes that are inland. So those are ones that are closer to us. The Seattle Fault you may have heard of. The Kendall Fault, also called the Boulder Creek Fault, is one that's more local to us. Rebecca mentioned this disaster portal. What is the name of the website?
The geology portal.
Yeah, the geology portal. Yeah, this website I cannot recommend highly enough. It's wonderful. You can look at the hazards associated with different earthquakes in the area. The crustal earthquakes, because they're very shallow and closer to us, we would experience probably in this area more violent ground shaking than we would expect from the 9. That said, the likelihood of those events occurring is substantially lower. So it is something we have to consider in the broader context of all of the hazards we have. But again, the recurrence interval on these things is closer to the thousands of years. It's less well known. We're still learning all the time what our local hazards are, what earthquake. We didn't know about the Kendall-Scar-Boulder Creek Fault until fairly recently. So we're still learning about those. There's a lot of work to be done. But there are multiple hazards, I guess, is the short answer. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a CERT volunteer. And when I took...
Speak into the microphone.
When I took the class, I was lucky enough to take it as a class that was sponsored by a group. Some of the people that I speak with are on limited incomes, and what their greatest barrier is financially. Are there sponsorships available for people or groups that want to take the CERT course but do not have the funding to do it?
Well, in Whatcom County, this is currently about the best deal you can find in town. It's an 8-week course, and we're only charging $25 for it, which is something to really be proud of. Yes, we want to bring down as many barriers as we can, and I'm willing, at this point, we haven't made any structural changes to like provide a sliding scale, but instead I'm willing to talk with anyone that has financial challenges and make sure that that's not a barrier that keeps them out of class.
Okay. There's a program called Whatcom Dreams that helps people get into their own housing and become independent, and I would recommend getting a hold of them and offering it at the end of their classes so that the people that are becoming independent would also have this under their belts.
Absolutely. The more people that we can see, the better.
And if you're a small business owner or a local business owner, hey, this sounds like a great opportunity for local charity spending. Let's get CERT volunteers that can't afford the training into the training.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for addressing us tonight. This is great. I have 3 questions. I'm just going to pose them out there so you can just answer them and then I'll move on. My first question is, I'm wondering how many volunteer mobilization centers would be needed in a major situation in our community, including all of Bellingham, because I live here. My other one is, how do we track lost people? I would like to know that. Part of my interest in that is because my family, even though I've been here in Washington for many, many, many years, and my family migrated here originally, I do have family in California who were impacted by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And people in my family were orphaned. So, you know, we lost track of them. So what do we do now in this day and age to track lost people? So the other thing I want to ask is, and please, you're all great, I have deep respect for you, but I kind of have a sense that there's been some turnover in our Division of Emergency Management, and I'd like to understand why. Thank you.
As far as the turnover, both Paul and I are too new to answer that.
Oh, well.
Having said that, I guess just to put that one aside, it's Ben, Francis, and Shalise really that have held the company or the organization together. And the other thing that both Bellingham and Whatcom County realized was that while we have independent emergency management organizations within each political jurisdictions, we have come together under the Whatcom Unified banner, and we operate really as one organization. It's one of the great success stories of Bellingham and Whatcom County working together.
And as part of the National Incident Management System, a lot of the questions that you have questions for locally, I can still have the ability to answer because we're all trained at a national level. So there may be specific things and hazards that I may not be familiar with being from the Midwest, but we still have that same operating system under ICS. To answer your question about the 1900 earthquake, and I apologize if I'm jumping in front of everybody else, one of the things that we do utilize is a family reunification center. So we open up these centers for people to go to so they can identify the people that are missing, and then we work through the process in order to get those people either reunified or identified at where they are. That has obviously evolved in the 100 years or 100 plus years since the 1900 earthquake, and I hope that answers your question as far as family reunification process.
There is another family reunification process, by the way, that works very well, and it's Facebook makes it, and they launch it in Find Your Friend, I think it's called, isn't it? Anybody remember? I think it's Find Your Friend or Report In, something like that. They launch that in any major disaster, and they're talking about expanding that out. So don't underestimate that.
And also highlighting out-of-area contacts as information to be able to get to people. Sometimes when cell towers are down, having the out-of-area contacts is another important tool to have for anybody to identify in a plan. And I know we had talked about identifying CERT volunteers, but one of the things that would be interesting to find out, how many of you have a family preparedness kit that will last you for 72 hours or more? That's great. Appreciate that.
With regards to the out-of-area contact, there were some, on the information table, there were some preparedness booklets that were out there. If you pick up one of those, you can find out more information about how the out-of-area contact could work for your family.
And part of her question was, how many VMCs are going to be needed in the case of a disaster? And how a VMC operates is the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office makes the call on whether one or more is needed. So we're looking to those guys and gals to say, okay, we need you to set up Ferndale High School, Nooksack, wherever, or even set up in a tent. And then that's where we need you, the volunteers. We estimate to set up one VMC for 3 days, 24/7. We're going to need 70 to 100 volunteers to staff that, because you got 3 shifts. You got about 30 people minimum per shift. So that's what we're looking at. And if they say we need 2 VMCs set up, you can see how the numbers just grow. Thanks.
Thanks, Mel.
I have a question about phones. When the big one hits, what's the relative vulnerability between the cell phone system and the landline system? And should one plan to have both?
I'd have everything you can get. One thing that we have learned from the National Institute of Urban Search and Rescue in studying disasters since the Mexico City earthquake is that, contrary to common belief, all communications are not lost. That's not to say they're all available, but if you look at something like 9/11, texting worked for almost everybody in most cases. They might not have gone through instantly. They might not have been have voice communication. The same is true if you have the old analog phone lines that run over copper wires. They've become a bit more problematic of late because they go back to digital switches. But if you can dial a phone, you might actually, with that dialing phone, believe it or not, be able to get through where you would not be able to with either your cell phone or a touch-tone phone, because they're actually based. Amateur radio, we haven't talked about amateur radio here. Again, mapping your neighborhood, finding out who in your neighborhood is the amateur radio operator. That's something we rely on. Look at everything. Don't discount that something won't work. And the last one, I'm sorry, I forgot, this is my favorite one, and that is when we were in Mogadishu, in Somalia, let's say that the internet infrastructure was a little weak, and to put it mildly, and sometimes it flat out didn't work, and we couldn't communicate between our locations. We used the bicycle net. Don't forget that you can use your bicycle, you can walk, or maybe even drive to communicate. You put your information on a disc, if that's what you're trying to get across, and you drive it, you walk it, and you give it to somebody.
I'll also add that in Japan, interestingly, cell phone towers worked for 24 hours while they had backup generators, and then they went down. So there was sort of an initial down, then a comeback, and then a down again, and then it took much longer for them to come back because the roadways weren't available. So you don't know what this is going to look like. Plan for some flexibility. a lot of diversity and different strategies. And for your household, plan a communication strategy that doesn't rely on technology.
Let's go one step further on this as well. We've thrown out the idea of an out-of-area contact, and that's very important. I didn't quite hear it made really clear that when we say out of area, we recommend that that other contact for you be preferably away from the West Coast. During a disaster scenario, it's quite common for local and regional communications to go down, and yet for it to be possible to get a message out of your area. So for example, my wife and I living here in Bellingham, our out-of-state contact is a family, friends of ours that live in Pennsylvania. There's a fair chance that we can get a text out to that person. And it's not enough just for each family member to have that phone number in their pocket, but you should have that. But also, have a small communication plan for yourselves, and that is, my wife knows what to say to our friend in Pennsylvania if something happens. I know what to say to that friend so that we can actually pass some meaningful communication and say to each other, I'm here at the college, I'm safe, I'm going to stay. I'm here at the Division of Emergency Management, I'm safe, I'm going to stay. I'll send my next message in 1 hour or in 12 hours, whatever the case may be. But this is a part of your preparedness as well, because if that communication infrastructure goes down, well, your most recent message is the most valuable one that you can send.
Back to geology a little bit and landslides. I live in Birch Bay, and there's a lot of bluff habitat all the way around to Semiahmoo. There's no bedrock. It's all steep up and down, and there's houses up there, and you can see walking the beach that they're trying various methods to keep it from sliding into the bay. And an earthquake, that stuff is not very solid. It's glacial lacustrine material. It's, it's clay. And moisture is, really makes it a mess of it. But then this tsunami, I guess, is going to hit the coastal zone the most, but it seems like undercutting, even high waves, undercutting that existing bluff, it's going to make those houses vulnerable, like Birch Bay Road or Birch Point Road that goes all the way around. There's houses up there that are, to me, sitting on a time bomb. I know you're not necessarily a geologist, but the geologist was talking here a minute ago, but I'm concerned about those houses are going to be possibly in the bay pretty quick.
Okay, well, there's a couple things to say, and then I'll pass it off to Jackie. First of all, land use planning matters. Putting houses on bluffs is not a great idea, and it's not really about the earthquakes, it's about the landslides.
It's a great view.
Yeah, it's not a great idea. The other thing that I'm going to point out is, thank goodness we have Vancouver Island. It's going to really take the brunt, and a lot of our inner coastline in Whatcom County is not going to get slammed with very much waves. However, Jackie probably has a lot to say.
Yeah, sadly, I really don't. Just as a seismologist, landslide, sort of the triggers and the knowing that local geology is not my personal primary expertise. There are certainly plenty of maps that will talk about the sort of the local geology. And again, we have that same glacial deposit, material all around here. We certainly know that after major earthquakes, there are landslides that are triggered there, and there are really excellent landslide hazard maps for Seattle. We don't have that here, and that's probably a direction that we could, continue to go to understand better where those hazards are. Again, where people live is a personal choice. The view is beautiful. I know people who study tsunamis and still choose to live in that area because the beach is beautiful, and there are risks people choose to take. That said, you have to know what your hazards are. We're required to know if we live in flood areas. There's some, good reason that we should all look at where we live and what those local hazards are and what our comfort level is. But no, you're absolutely right that earthquakes trigger landslides. So.
Thank you. We are at about 12:05. If we could just take 2 more questions, and you were in line, and maybe that would be it. Okay.
My question is about the trains and the people that live along the tracks. Is it true that you can tell what's inside the train by the markings on the outside? And if that is true,
Yes.
do we have access to that information?
Yes. Yes. Department of Transportation puts out a book that has, you can Google it on the internet, and it'll give you the identification marks for the train.
They have placards,
Yeah.
they're picture placards that you'll be able to identify.
Yeah.
Numbers.
My question is on emergency management protocol. If there's a North American power grid failure extended beyond 90 days, what the plan is from your standpoint as far as communication?
Yeah. Well, obviously, if it's more than 90 days, we're going to be, on a national power grid basis, we're going to be as much a victim as anybody. Having said that, there are, one of the areas, well, we would move to emergency generator power to be able to maintain essential public service communications. And we have agreements in place to be able to continually fuel the generator and generators. That said, that's generally true also of all the fire stations. So in that context, that's there. It would have a fairly significant and major impact. One of the areas, though, that you as individuals really should take a serious look at is the use of small solar panels to be able to power things like cell phones and your iPads. That's not to say that the internet will necessarily be up, but you may be able to communicate.
What about essential services such as water in that environment?
In a power outage situation, same thing. All the water and sewer districts, at least that I'm aware of in the county, do have power generating and do have the ability to get it out, continue to pump water. Whether people on wells and so on, that, as was addressed earlier, that's a little bit of a different question. Most of our water is gravity fed here. There are areas, of course, that do have pumps going in there, but most of those pumps I'm aware of, especially in the city of Bellingham, have emergency generation.
And then on the individual side, having just a regular rain 50-gallon or 55-gallon rain bucket that captures the rain, because it obviously does rain here a lot, with a hand pump and some sort of water tablet, I forget what the name of that is, a purifier, filters, thank you, that you can utilize on hand until we can get water back up and running.
But hey, strap the rain barrel to your house so it doesn't fall over.
Thank you.
In your resilience presentation, you mentioned talking about residential houses and how the building code since 1976 have been appropriate, but most of our mid-rise and high-rise buildings downtown have actually been built well before that. And do you know what type of assessment or exercises or anything the city of Bellingham has done to deal with or annotate the mid-rise and high-rise buildings downtown and the hazards they're going to present? And because you mentioned strong shaking, so what is their survivability, and has anybody assessed that?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to say here. First of all, our biggest concerns are unreinforced masonry construction. That's Railroad Avenue and Fairhaven, a little bit of Ferndale. That's highly problematic. The level of shaking that we're talking about in a Cascadia earthquake is most likely not going to create piles of rubble, but could pull parapets down and the cornices and all the fancy brickwork on top. The sidewalk next to those buildings is not a safe place to be, as we saw with the Nisqually earthquake in Pioneer Square. There are assessments, and you can go to the seismic catalog online and look at the census block level to see what kind of high-level damage, sort of collapse-level damage and moderate damage for building infrastructure there is. I'm an engineer by training. I'm somewhat worried, but not extremely worried. We're not going to see something like Haiti. We're not going to see something like Nepal.
I will add to that, by the way, that while there are a lot of buildings, particularly in Fairhaven and Railroad, as was mentioned, if there's more than 10% improvement work done on those structures, they have to come up to seismic standards, among other standards. And a lot of the buildings haven't been done yet, but the parapet and the other outside items, that's a little different. That is really where the hazard is. Most of them have been touched in some form or another. Most of the 3- and 4-story apartments that are now along the trail and along Railroad Avenue were built obviously in the last 5 years. Those probably are okay. We've heard a lot about the catalog, by the way, and it did just move. I don't know if you know that, but if you go to DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, and Google Protection GIS seismic scenarios, that's the new address for that seismic catalog. So,
Okay.
Protection GIS seismic scenarios, or you could probably just Google. Yeah, seismic scenarios will get you there.
Okay, we're going to take one last question because we need to be respectful of our panel.
Okay, but I want to add one more thing about buildings because I want to seed you with an idea. One thing that Seattle does that we don't do is they treat the unreinforced masonry parapets that are so problematic under nuisance ordinances, and they go after the building owners and say, you have a nuisance. That's a safety hazard. You must retrofit it. And it's not particularly expensive to put a little brace on that parapet. We haven't done that, but if somebody wants to take on the building department, let's do it.
So again, we're going to do one last question, and then there was the ability to submit some questions in advance. Now, we were going to use those questions as sort of a fill-in, but there's not been that opportunity. So what we are going to do is ask the panel, we're going to email the questions that were submitted to the panel, ask them to respond, and then post them on the website for the Volunteer Center. So that way those that who submitted questions, they've not been answered, we don't want you to feel that you've been overlooked, forgotten, or neglected. So we want to make sure those get addressed. One question, please.
Thank you very much for all you guys giving your time to do this for us. I was just wondering, there hasn't been much talk about FEMA activation and how that would all encompass Whatcom County, and so I was just wondering how that would be addressed.
They might come here.
Maybe yes.
Now, let me explain that. The reality is, if we have a Cascadia event, or something that's not a localized event, such as Boulder Creek, that doesn't affect the rest of the state, they have to set their priorities too. And what you have, about 1,300 people dead here and 7,000 injured, something like that. Compare that with, 13,000 down south and 40 to 50,000 people injured. Let's be realistic. We don't have enough resources in the United States to really be able, it's going to have international aid starting to come in, just as we saw in Katrina. So we're going to have to understand, we hear 72 hours you need to be on your own before you get here. I tell my family, I tell my kids, plan on at least 2 weeks, and that's bare minimum. Personally, my wife and I plan on a month. FEMA will come. And they are good people, and they're trying to do the right thing. But let's be realistic in a big scenario like that and where it'll fall out.
And let's also be realistic in the sense of we want to be resilient and prepared enough that FEMA and international aid can focus on the people that are really going to be affected, which is our coastal communities, and we want to be supportive of them and allow the aid to go where it's really needed.
Let me add to that just a little bit. We have some large resources like American Red Cross. We have the ability to operate autonomously or within an ICS structure with the other agencies. So we have the added benefit of being able to bring in those resources in a large-scale disaster. And so you can expect that to happen. But a piece that we haven't discussed is how you're going to know where those things are. And so before we go, I just want to mention, getting that information, that's a key part of your plan. And so there are emergency updates you can sign up for on the Whatcom Unified website, whatcomready.org. You can also download free American Red Cross apps to an app device, like a phone or a tablet. And there's great information on there, but the real value is that we're able to send updates to the apps on your device if we have cell service, of course, to let you know, hey, this is where you go to get help. There's food and water, or here's an update on what we expect to be happening in your area during a disaster.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, yes, Greg.
And if I can make a final appeal, you folks, your awareness has been raised this morning with all that's been presented to you, and some of the threats we face are periodic, on a geological timescale, and catastrophic, and others we know are seasonal and come around year after year. And I know that my inbox and my voicemail box are going to be full when I go back to the office after today. Let's not make this a crash diet of preparedness. Instead, let's think about this as a bit of lifestyle change. We want to make a habit of this rather than just run out this afternoon and do something that doesn't get maintained and repeated on a regular basis.
So thank you very much. So the other thing is that, you know, for those of you who had signed up, I believe we have your email addresses and we'll be able to communicate with you further. But thank you so much for everything. Thank you.